The internet has changed the world in my lifetime, and web designers have been the ones shaping that experience. Let's explore the history and maybe even the future of web design. In 1990, a British physicist named Tim Berners-Lee became the father of the web by creating the first browser. A year later, he shared the first 18 HTML tags. The first publicly accessible sites looked like Word documents with some blue underlined text, which was the default for all links. It wasn't until 1992 when the first image was uploaded to the web, which apparently was this. In the mid-90s, the web had entered the public consciousness, but even my school didn't yet have an internet connection. I had to go to the library to get online, or round to my pal Johnny's house, as he was the first guy I knew who had internet at home. Shout out to Johnny's dad for that. There was no Google, and we would literally sit there trying to think of organisations that might have websites so we could surf the information superhighway, which is what people used to call web browsing, amazingly. Try NASA.com. Alright, it worked. They've got like 6 different pages on their site. This is awesome. I think it was 1998 when I designed and published my first website, armed with nothing more than a text editor and Microsoft Paint. It was difficult for the non-programmer to publish on the web, but sites like GeoCities and software like Adobe PageMail and Microsoft FrontPage made it just about possible. That sounds great, but I seem to remember most of those websites being pretty minimal, with a classic under construction GIF and obligatory hit counter. It was around this time that my own grandfather called the internet a fad. Anyway, enough about how old I am and more about the web, which was exploding. In 1992 there were just 10 websites online. By 1994, about 3,000. By 97, over 1 million. Technologies like Java, JavaScript, ASP and CCS broadened the possibilities of web design. Web designers were growing in number 2 and spending time on sites like W3C, the Nielsen Norman Group, A List Apart and Design is Kinky to develop their coding and visual skills. Google came along. Everyone I knew now had an internet-connected computer at home. But web design really took a turn in a different direction with the advent of Flash. You might remember it by the annoyance of installing and updating Flash Player about 271 times a year. It was basically an animation software with interactive components. What it did was release websites from the rigid limitations of HTML, where everything had to be placed in boxes, and allowed designers to create freeform layouts, include video, motion transitions, and in-browser games. It was at this time, 2004 specifically, that I became a full-time web designer and had to go beyond HTML, CSS and graphic software and learn Flash, which allowed for an explosion of creativity. Studios like 2Advance were leading the way, with mini sites for campaigns being a common use case. Vertical scrolling, which is now instinctual, was avoided on homepages, with everything appearing above the fold in a rigid layout. Flash was eventually killed by its inability to be indexed by search engines, lack of accessibility, security concerns and Steve Jobs' refusal to include Flash Player on the iPhone, followed by his public attack on the technology in this open letter. And so it died, along with all that time I spent learning ActionScript. Macromedia's other web design product, Dreamweaver, which offered both a WYSIWYG and text editor, was a market leader for many years, either side of the millennium, along with Fireworks, a web-focused graphic software. All of these were adopted by and then later amalgamated within the Adobe suite following their purchase of Macromedia in 2005. As technology became more advanced and new programming languages were adopted, the distinction between designers and developers became meaningful and grew wider. I was working at an agency where I was expected to both design posters and write databases in code. Not exactly the same skill set. Then came Web 2.0. which at first just seemed to mean loads of gradients and glass buttons, but then everyone decided that was silly, and Web 2.0 became the age of social media. Firstly, publishing on the web became much easier with services like Blogger, DeviantArt, Wikipedia and Flickr. Then teenagers' habits switched from instant messaging to MySpace, Bebo and the Facebook. Twitter, which was spelt differently, launched in 2006, allowed users to post via text message and promised that we'd never be bored again. Unbelievably, they weren't wrong about that. Once Tumblr, Pinterest and Instagram came along and download speeds allowed for consistent video playback, causing YouTube to flourish, we entered the age of infinite scrolling, and internet use became the world's biggest addiction. Design styles began to change as we entered the 2010s. Typography improved as the rendering and availability of web fonts progressed, and although Apple was seen as leaders in design, it was actually the 2010 Windows Phone that pioneered the flat design style, which would come to dominate user interfaces. Apple was still heavily reliant on skeuomorphism, making icons that reflected real-world objects with detail and texture. But the minimal flat style of the Windows Phone UI was followed by its adoption in Windows 8 for PC, and subsequently became a major influence on designers. Mobile was the next frontier. With the rise of smartphones and tablets, responsive design became a necessity. Designers who had only ever designed for a large landscape canvas now had to consider a small portrait one. Accessibility and inclusion rightly became a key concern. The first responsive site was Audi, amazingly, back in 2001, but it was phones that forced truly responsive design to emerge. The Opera Mini web browser appeared in 2005, and the launch of the iPhone in 2007, which included Safari, popularized mobile browsing. And yes, I did get an iPhone 1 on the day it came out in the UK. Web design has developed its own set of standards, just as print design had over hundreds of years. Many of the old principles about typesetting, for example, like hierarchy, line length, contrast, font choices, have re-established their importance in digital design. Looking at the evolution of sites that have been around since the 90s, we can see the development of web design playing out. Whereas the early internet was filled with playful experimentation, we now have data on how users navigate websites, and that informs design decisions which have become critical business functions. The technological limitations of the early web prevented the elegance one might have found back then in a photography coffee table book or a fashion magazine. But now we can have style whilst remaining clear, accessible and effective. In the 2020s, imagery needs to be high quality, interfaces intuitive and content engaging to match the limited patience and attention span of the user. Today, almost anybody can get a website online using website builders and templates, and with the increasing use of AI, the low-hanging fruit of basic, low-budget websites will cease to be created by professional web designers and developers. So what will happen to the profession? Will we still need web designers in the future, or is this role going to fizzle out just as quickly as it appeared? Well, in 2022, Adobe acquired Figma for $20 billion, a design software that was only released 6 years prior. This demonstrates just how valuable digital design is today. Web design, in truth, is already being subsumed or expanded, depending on how you look at it, into wider design disciplines, with new terms gaining prominence like product and UX UI. Augmented and virtual reality will be adopted more widely, and a growing array of physical products will be internet connected in smart homes and workplaces. The fundamental skills of art direction and user experience design will absolutely be required in the future. The field of web design is only around 30 years old. Compare that to other design disciplines like furniture, for example, which has been around for thousands of years. And that tells me we're just getting started. But let me know what you think in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this trip down memory lane, or for our younger viewers, journey to the ancient past. Until next time, happy designing.